Hello and welcome to the Healing Element Podcast, a weekly discussion giving you the tools to understand and heal from intergenerational trauma. I am your host, Kai Marie. To find out more information about the topics discussed today, visit kaimarie.com. Hello and welcome to the Healing Element. I am your host, Kai Marie, and I have a very special guest with me today. I have Brandon Jones, and we're going to know a little bit more about him. But before we get started, wanted to let you know again the topic that we'll be discussing today. The title is, Can Trauma Be a Predictor of Your Future? We're going to take a deeper look into adverse childhood experience, or ACEs, the study that occurred, and its connection to historical trauma in the African American community. So before we do a formal introduction to Brandon, we have to talk about his bio because we have the perfect person for our discussion today. Brandon is a psychotherapist, professor, consultant. He specializes in adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, historical and intergenerational trauma, social and emotional intelligence, leadership, and youth justice. Born and raised in St. Paul, Minnesota, Brandon has survived living in a home of domestic violence and various other forms of trauma. Brandon holds a BA in Sociology from the University of Minnesota, a master's in community psychology from Metropolitan State University, and a master's in psychotherapy, MFT, from Adler Graduate School. Brandon is also a 2013 Bush Foundation Leadership Fellow. He is a professor at Metropolitan State University, Inverhills College, did I say that correctly?
Yep,
Okay.
you got that right.
And Century College. He lives by the motto of live life with purpose on purpose. I love that motto.
Thank you. Thank you.
So with that, Brandon, welcoming you to the podcast. Such a pleasure to have you, and I'm looking forward to our conversation today.
Absolutely. I'm excited. Thank you for having me. I'm sure it's going to be a pleasure. If you ever need me to come back, I'm here for you. So.
And I think I'll take you up on that already.
Let's make it happen.
Okay, so to start off our discussion today, I wanted to start with the quote that's in your 5-day course. And I went through the course. I thought it was phenomenal. I think it's something that African Americans should definitely go through the course and really understand how historical trauma impacts us to this day. A lot of times we kind of look at where we are present day, but it's helpful to understand where you are now. You have to kind of go back to realize, to put all the pieces together. And I think your course did a wonderful job of doing that. And so to start off, you had a quote that said, pass on a lineage of healing to the next generation. Is this something that you would consider this quote kind of like your life motto? And what are the steps that you think that we can do to begin to pass on that lineage of healing?
Absolutely. Thank you. For me, it's funny that you pulled, of all the quotes you pulled that one, because I just kind of said that. Like, that's not something that I have like put on my wall or on my Instagram account or anything like that. But it's a reality. And, in the work that I do in mental health and human services, there's a lot of talk about breaking cycles. And we've been talking about breaking cycles for years. But really, to break cycles, you really have to, you have to go to the pain point. You have to go to where the trauma is, where the adversity has come from, and you have to be honest and real about it. But at the same time, you have to do something about it. It's one step to go there. It's another step to actually have action. And a lot of people don't have the action because a lot of that pain is hard to deal with. We sweep things under the rug. As Black folks, we just kind of accept pain and trauma as our norm, and it becomes very, very difficult. So for me, having a lineage of healing takes a lot of effort from the individual. Right. And you're really stepping out to do something different. And most of your family members or even your partner or spouse or whatever the case may be might not be in that same place and space as you. And it makes it very uncomfortable. It can be isolating. So people don't do it. People don't move forward. They don't actually do it. But what I encourage people to do is when we're talking about healing from the past, dealing with your present and building for your future, is you have to deal with that past. You have to understand what has happened. You have to be real about it. You have to understand your parents made some mistakes. They may have been traumatized themselves. You have to, you might have to call us some family truths about, X, Y, and Z happened in our family, and this person hurt me, and this is why, I'm dealing with the pain that I'm dealing with. And that's just the reality. But for some reason, it's so uncomfortable. And we also have created a culture where it's not expected for us to be honest about this stuff,
Right.
that we don't do it. So what I do with my clients, with the people that I work with and that I help, is they have to just get real with those realities. And unfortunately, sometimes you got to just kind of own it.
Mm-hmm.
For example, in my bio, you talked about I survived living in a household of domestic violence. That is real. I still deal with that till this day.
Mm-hmm.
I've done my own therapy. Before I became a therapist, I said, if I'm going to talk to anybody on the couch, I need to be on that same couch myself.
Mm-hmm.
And I did a year of therapy just to deal with the domestic violence and stuff that I've seen, and also not having a father and what that meant to me, developing as a Black man. But that was very important for me if I was going to do this work. But I also had to continue to do work and do my own kind of personal development, healing. I'm really big into cognitive behavioral therapy,
Mm-hmm.
etc. Those things have been very, very helpful for me, even to this day, because my trauma and my pain started before I was even born. The stuff that my mom dealt with, the stuff that she dealt with her mother, how my family, I'm from Minnesota, how my family even got here is traumatic as well, running from things, looking for economic opportunity, etc., like a lot of Black folks.
Mm-hmm.
And that pain all leads up to me and what I've experienced and why my mom decided to become a partner with the individual she decided to become a partner with. Why my mom ended up having a baby before she graduated and became 18, before she graduated high school with myself. Like, all that trauma comes from somewhere. It didn't just happen, right? And I
Right.
think as individuals, sometimes we look at ourselves as the problem. It's like when people get divorced.
Mm-hmm.
When parents get divorced, the children sometimes, a lot of times actually, the children start to blame themselves. Like, it's because of
Right.
me that you two have gotten divorced, etc. It's the same thing with our pain and our trauma. It's like, why does my mom or why does my dad or why do my family act like this? Is it me? You might have been the person that got, sexually touched, molested or sexually assaulted or whatever the case may be. And then you start blaming yourself as the victim. And that's not what the issue is. It's the family never dealt with it. Family never told you to stay away from that cousin or that uncle or that auntie or whoever. The family just said, well, I don't believe that happened or whatever happened. We're gonna let that go on. We're gonna pray and move on from it.
Mm-hmm.
And things just don't, things don't happen. And you have to live with that pain. And then you become a parent. And now you're
Right.
parenting your child based on the trauma that you've experienced. And now your family looking at you crazy, like, why you don't want to come around us during Thanksgiving? And now you got to deal with all that craziness, right?
Right.
But this is stuff
Right.
this is the stuff that happens, right?
Yeah.
And we have to be real about that stuff. And we have to deal with it. And unfortunately, the expectation and the effort has to take place with you as an individual rather than with everybody else first. And that change is very hard for us to deal with, because when you start changing, people notice and people respond to you changing. And when you start changing, now they asking you, what's wrong with you? Why you acting like that? Like, why you acting different, or you acting bougie or whatever? They're gonna
Right.
say
Right.
anything because you are out of the norm of the
Mm-hmm.
typical behavior of just letting things be what they are and moving on when the pain continues to go. And that's why I talk about, you have to have this lineage of healing, because
Mm-hmm.
it requires change. It requires being uncomfortable. There is no growth in the comfort zone, and there's no comfort in the growth zone. And you have to keep moving forward.
That, whoo, you done said it. That's
Yeah.
so true though, because even on my own personal journey, it took time for me to be really by myself and
Yep.
to deal with my own trauma. You can't deal with trauma when you're surrounded by other people. You have to have some time to yourself, and that could be going to therapy. You just need that time to yourself to say, okay, I need to get with my thoughts, and I need to deal with the hurt and pain that's within me,
Hmm.
before you can start to mend those relationships. And what I've also learned is that when you are healing from trauma and you start speaking your truth of
Hmm.
what actually happened to you, that does affect the relationships that you have with other people. So, for anyone listening, if you are on that path and you're beginning your healing journey, sometimes it can be lonely. It can feel very isolating because you're now starting to deal with stuff, as you said, Brandon, that other throughout the lineage, right, throughout the family line, has just been kind of swept under the rug. And now you're starting to bring stuff in the forefront because you have to deal with trauma. As my cousin likes to say, if you don't deal with trauma, it will deal with you. So,
Absolutely.
so that's something that we just have to remind. And that's why it's so important to have like that safety net and a support system when you're going through your healing journey, which is
Absolutely.
continuous.
Yeah, let me add on to that. I think because what you said is very important. Sometimes the things that are traumatic, we don't recognize as trauma,
Right.
especially for Black people, especially for us, because we have really developed a culture around responding to adversity, trauma, systematic racism, direct racism, white
Right.
supremacy, if you want to go that deep. Like,
Mm-hmm.
we have built a culture around it. I mean, literally, we used to call Black culture the struggle, and we've
Right.
owned it. We've
Mm-hmm.
owned it, and we
Mm-hmm.
own that pain, and we eat that pain like Skittles. Like, it's something that we should enjoy, right?
Right.
But we
Right.
don't
It's
have
like a
we
badge of honor.
yeah, it's like,
Mm-hmm.
and the craziest thing, if you want to talk about Black women, for
Mm-hmm.
Black women, it's like you ain't a strong Black woman if you haven't dealt with pain. And what type of development is that for an individual, no matter if you're a male or female or otherwise?
Mm-hmm.
That is not a healthy. That's not a healthy projection of who you are and who you should be by being able to deal with pain.
Mm-hmm.
Dealing with pain does have a positive end to it. When you can go through adversity, it builds confidence, etc.
Mm-hmm.
But you can't lose the fact that there's still hurt that has been done in it. You
Right.
can't lose
Right.
that fact.
Right.
And that pain doesn't just go away, it sits with you. There are
Mm-hmm.
a lot of us that need to heal that inner child and that stuff that we've dealt with. And many of us don't know how to, because we don't even think anything was wrong.
Right.
We don't think, I always give the example of when I got my butt whooped by my grandma for the first time. It was the first time last time because I learned. I was like, oh no, this woman crazy. I always heard these stories about her. Now it was my turn. But my grandmother, she actually, let me just tell you the story because it's actually pretty funny.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm an older millennial, and back in my day when I was growing up, I used to watch a lot of wrestling. At the time, it was WWF, and there used to be this group called DX, and they would run around doing this little thing like this
Uh-huh.
towards their genitals, saying "suck it." I don't know if people
Oh,
remember
I
that, right?
remember that. Yeah.
So I was doing that with my cousins playing, and I don't know. My grandma was the quietest person up the steps ever, and she
Uh-huh.
just appeared out of nowhere. She said, "Suck what?" And I got the butt whooping of my life. So what she made me do, she made me go outside and get a switch. So I went out there, got the switch. First of all, she cussed me out and told me that she was gonna whip my butt all bad, and she gave me the whole lecture. And then she made
Mm-hmm.
me go get a switch. So I go get the switch to get my butt whooped, and she said, "Go get another one." So I had to go get another switch to get my butt whooped. Then she said, "Go get another one." So I had to get 3 switches.
Yeah.
Then she tied the switches up with a rubber band and
Wow.
proceeded to whoop my butt.
Mm-hmm.
Now, like I said, first time, last time.
Mm-hmm.
The whooping wasn't the thing that hurt me the most. It was the psychological process of going to get my switch, and that wasn't good enough. Going to get another one, that wasn't good enough. Then getting the third one and seeing her tie it up, me having to sit there and wait for that punishment. Now, where does that come from? Right? That comes from years of the same thing happening to her and to her siblings. And that's probably where her father and her mother learned the same type of discipline. And all that stuff goes back to the lineage of slavery, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where we
Mm-hmm.
got beat for doing things incorrectly. Now, my grandmother, she could have just gave me a little pinch on the cheek or pinch on the arm and said, "Boy, don't you ever say that again." It would have been
Mm-hmm.
done.
Mm-hmm.
But it was this whole process, this ritual of discipline from my grandmother's standpoint, her not knowing, what kind of abuse that could have been. But I will never forget that moment.
Right.
And
Right.
like I said, first time, last time, I was
Last
like,
time.
okay, I'm never going to have this happen to me again.
Right.
Learn my lesson. But at
Mm-hmm.
the same time, even at the age of 33 years old now, it still sticks
Mm-hmm.
with me, right?
Right.
And
Right.
now I'm like, I would never put my kid through that. Like,
Mm-hmm.
my kids get scared if I just raise my voice a little bit. I don't have a deep voice. They're like, "Oh my God, my dad's tripping." But it's a whole different type of paradigm because
Right.
of how I raised them, and what I consider discipline to be is very different from where they're at.
Very true. And do you think that because of what you've gone through, is that what's led you into this career path that you have through your own experiences, wanting to now reach out to our community and really kind of express them, okay, this is not normal, what we've now kind of adopted as like this is just how our families operate. It's like, no, that's not the case. This is because trauma has occurred and this is how you can deal with it.
Great question. I kind of stumbled into mental health.
Mm-hmm.
I originally went to college to be a dentist, believe it or not. I originally went to school to be a dentist. And that was a whole crazy thing. I was a smart kid. I was really a nerd, but I had athletic ability. I was recruited to play football, all this good stuff. And the only reason I went to school to be a dentist is because no one in my family ever went to college, really. I had one cousin who went to college, and she was a college basketball player. That was a little bit different than everybody else's experience. So when it was my turn, I didn't know what to do, and my barber was like, "Brandon, you smart. Dentists make a lot of money. You should be a dentist." So that's what I did because I listened to my barber. I was like, "All right, cool." So went to school and got into pre-dentistry classes and almost flunked out. Actually, I got put on academic probation my first semester because I was lying, telling people I was on the football team when I wasn't. I was on a predominantly white campus, so nobody asked questions. Like, here's a black dude. He know black people. He know the football players. I told everybody I was a redshirt freshman, which means you sit out your first year, right? I don't know if people know what that is, but I was smart enough to know that, so I was like, hey, I'm gonna just front. I'm gonna lie and kick it, and that's what I did. So I get access to all the football stuff. I get access to the girls, the parties, all that stuff, because everybody think I'm on a football team. But I wasn't hitting the books like I should have. And I thought, in high school, I went to public high school. I didn't really study that much. I could just pass because I just had the intellectual ability to do that. But in college, it was a different type of ball game. And I learned very quickly when I got put on academic probation. But at that time, I was only passing one class, and that class was called People and Problems. And I think the only reason I was passing because I knew a lot of people with a lot of problems. So it just kind of came natural. And one day in lecture, the professor was just asking all these questions and no one was answering them but me. So she pointed me out in class and she said, whoever's going to study with this kid for the next exam is going to pass. And I was like, whoa, this lady just pointed me out in like a lecture hall of like 80 people. So after class, I went up to her and talked to her like, look, like, I don't know what you got planned, but you should be pointing me out. Like I got real uncomfortable. And she said, no, Brandon, I've been reading your essays. Like, you're really good at this and you should get a PhD in it. And I'm like, well, what is this? She said, this is sociology. So I ended up switching my major to sociology then, and I didn't even know what a PhD was. So I had to go back to my dorm room and Google a PhD. And I found out, there's college after college called grad school, because I didn't have any of that knowledge being a first generation college student. Yeah. So that's how I got into helping people. The other weird thing that happened for me in college is I had a lot of female friends. I was the dude, like, if you knew a girl that you liked, I was cool with her because that was like my strategy, because cute girls always got cute girl friends. So I was like, it worked for me. Seriously, it worked. So I was that dude. I didn't join a frat because I was like, no, they're going to see me as just some dude who I only get girls because I'm in a frat, or I only get girls because I'm an athlete or whatever. So that wasn't my thing. My thing was I'm going to be cool with all the cute girls because they all got cute girl friends. So, but these girls kept telling me all these problems.
That's the tip for tonight.
Yeah. So if you are a young man, if you are articulate and you ain't trying to sleep with the women, you can get their friends. That's how it works. So I was smart though. I knew that. I learned that in senior year of high school. I had a whole bunch of female friends, and their friends would be with them, and their friends would like me. So I was like, this works. So yeah. Anyway, but what was happening in school was I kept having all these young ladies tell me about these traumatic things that happened to them. I had some female friends who've been sexually assaulted. That's why I talk a lot about sexual assault, because that's something I pay a lot of attention to. Before a whole Me Too movement, abuse has been happening. Right. I had female friends with all types of mental health challenges, and I had young women who were dropping out of school, and I'm like, what happened to you? Like, what happened? They're like, I just couldn't do it, anxiety, all this stuff. And it just made me think, like, why do these girls keep telling me all this craziness? Because my male friends weren't saying nothing. They weren't telling me about none of their struggles. But these young women kept telling me all this stuff. And I'm like, why do these girls keep telling me all this crazy stuff? So that made me start thinking like, I'm kind of like a helper. Like, people like coming to me for advice. And then that's when I started to think about, how do I get paid to do this? And shortly after that, by the time I got to senior year, I was working in a psych ward, downtown St. Paul. And that was my introduction to like real mental health, what we call serious sustained mental illness. And I was like, wow, there are people in my life that probably have mental illnesses that I didn't even realize. And then that was my light bulb. And that's how I got into mental health. Ended up getting a master's degree in psychology. About halfway through that program, I realized that if I wanted to make real good money as a professional, I had to get a mental health license. And my program that I was in wouldn't allow me to do that. So that's why I went back and got a second master's degree in psychotherapy. And that's what kind of kicked off my journey. But I've always kind of been a natural helper, because my college experience, people just came to me with just random crazy stuff. And I'm just like, what is going on in your life? Let me try to help you with it if I can. So it was kind of a natural thing. I definitely think that it has to do with me being a firstborn. Like, I'm the oldest and I have two younger brothers, and the stuff that we've seen and me always protecting them and helping them through stuff. I do think that has something to do with it, but really it was my college experience that launched me into it.
Wow. So when you started on that path, how did you, now as far as the intergenerational trauma and historical trauma, when did you start looking more into that aspect?
Yeah, great question. My mentor. So back in 2009, I met this man by the name of Sam Simmons. He throws a big conference here in the Twin Cities every summer in June called the Black Men Healing Conference.
Mm-hmm.
So one of my grad school professors told me that I needed to interview him for my master's thesis, which was on Black male leadership. So I went to go meet this man. He's like 6'6", 280 pounds, scruffy beard, angry Black man. Like that's how he describes himself. So he goes, "Young buck, sit down and be quiet." That's what he tells me when I meet him. I'm like, "Who is this old man telling me to be quiet?" So he just goes, "Sit down," and he just starts talking. And he's like, "What's your questions that you want to ask me?" So I gave him a list of my questions. So we're gonna talk about this. We're gonna talk about trauma. And I'm like, "What is he talking about?" So he just starts talking. And as he's talking, it's like that moment where people who don't go to church, but then you go to church and you feel like the pastor's talking to you. That was one of those type of situations. I was like, he talking about my life. He don't know me.
Who you spoke to before this?
Yeah. So he's just telling me about like Black folks and the things that we've been through and this trauma. And before that, I never had a label for it. And at that moment, I was like, wow, this dude, I mean, he literally changed the whole direction of my master's thesis. And ever since that moment, I've stuck close to him. I worked for him. To this day, we still work together. I help him with the conference every year. And it was really Sam Simmons who brought this whole concept of trauma into frame for me and historical trauma. And then I started doing my own research, and that's how I got connected with like Dr. Joy DeGruy-Leary, Naeem Akbar, who wrote the book, what was his book called? The Psychological, he wrote a book that's also around kind of this idea of post-traumatic slave syndrome. Can't think of it right now, but it led me down this path of what has taken place for Black folks and how did we get to where we are today? Because a lot of us just feel like it happened, like it's always been like this, and it hasn't. But we have always kind of responded to struggle, but we've never been in a situation like we're into today. And having that label has been very, very important for me because it takes a lot of the pressure off of us as individuals and say, this is a systematic thing. There's a reason that Black folks in North Carolina, Black folks in Oakland, Black folks in New Orleans, Black folks in Minnesota all have a similar type of background. There's a reason for that. It didn't just happen. You know, we ain't people like this. Like something happened to us. We didn't just do this to ourselves per se.
Right. That's so true. And that goes back to our earlier conversation when we said in order to kind of understand where we are now, you have to go back because there's a story behind the current condition of our family and our communities. And so to that point, this kind of leads us right into ACEs, the study that was done. Can you talk to us a little bit? What is ACEs?
Absolutely. Yeah. So ACEs, also known as adverse childhood experiences. For folks who are viewing this, if you Google it, you might run across a term called adverse community experiences, which is kind of the newer version, expanded version of ACEs. But the original version was a study that was done from 95 to 97 by two medical doctors, Dr. Anda and Dr. Valetti, who were medical doctors who studied obesity from UCal Berkeley, so University of California, Berkeley. And in the 80s, they did this pretty big obesity study. And what they found out was a lot of people who were chronically obese had some kind of childhood adverse situation that took place. So like good researchers, they decided to find some additional funds to look at this other issue. So they teamed up with the CDC, and they also teamed up with Kaiser Permanente, which is a pretty well-to-do, like middle-class type of insurance. Like you got to have a decent job to have this type of insurance. So they teamed up and they did this massive study on adverse childhood experiences. And they they surveyed over 17,000 participants for this actual study. And what they determined was they had a 10-question questionnaire, and they had all these kind of indicators that were in three areas: household dysfunction, neglect, and abuse. So they had those three areas in 10 questions that represented those three areas. And what they determined was if you scored a 4 out of 10, so if you answered yes to 4 of those questions out of 10, it dramatically increased your probability of having both social issues and physical health issues and mental health issues as well. Or behavioral health is probably a better way to determine that. And so this study comes out, it becomes a big national thing. It's the first time that we actually look at a dominant population, white folks, and realize, oh, they got issues as well. Of the original studies, almost 75% of the people who actually took the survey were Caucasian. The median age was like 50, I think 54 years old. Most people who took it were college educated. So we're talking about middle class white folks with trauma and how it has these impacts on their health and on their social abilities. So it became this national phenomenon. When I talk about ACEs, I think that it's important, but when we articulate it in the frame of Black people, we have to be very careful because this ACE study is not culturally competent at all. The first question on the ACE study made me chuckle because I'm actually a trained facilitator in my state to train on the ACE study. So when we went through training, we had to do our own ACE study. And my score is a 7 out of 10, which scared me to death. But I'll talk about that in a moment. I was like, oh my God, I'm going to die. Literally, because that's what the study says is you will die early if your score is so high.
Right.
So the first question is, has an adult ever pushed, shoved, insulted, or cursed at you? Yeah. And I just was like, whoa. Every adult in my life has told me to sit my little black ass down, right? Like I've heard that so many times. It was an automatic 1 for me. And then I went through the rest of the questions and I scored a 7 and I was like, wow, what does this mean? And then they shared with us some of the results of what your scores mean. And if you score a 6 out of 10, you have a 20-year life decrease in your life expectancy. Wow. So if you're supposed to die at 80, if your ACE score is a 6, you will die at 60. And that scares me to death because when I look at when you break down life expectancy rates by ethnicity and gender, Black men typically die around 53. So that means I'm about to die this year. Yeah. Based on that study, which scares me to death, right? So it's a very important study for us, but at the same time, it's not culturally responsive to who we are as a people. Now, there's been some work since that original study to kind of make it a little bit more urbanized. And the Philadelphia ACE study, which was done, I think, in 2009 or 2010, that study did push forward the look at urban population. So they had a lot more representation of people of color, especially Black folks. They asked some more urbanized questions, like if you've ever been in foster care, do you feel like you live in a war zone, were you ever bullied? All these types of questions that are a little bit more urbanized, quote unquote. And the results were a lot different, but they still had the same kind of premise that the more ACEs you had, the worse symptomology you would end up having physically, from a behavioral health standpoint, which is mental health and chemical health, and then also socially. So that's the ACE study in a nutshell. I'm not saying don't take it as a serious study. It is important. If you Google ACEs, you can find the questionnaire for free online and tons of information on it. I absolutely think that it's a great tool, but we have to always keep the cultural context in mind when we look at it, because Black folks have a different cultural existence than other people in the United States.
Right, for sure. And if you're looking in the event of this discussion tonight, you'll see that I did post the 2 different diagrams. So one is from the ACEs study, and the other one is the one that's actually in your course, Brandon, that shows at the bottom that says the conception, which talks about the historical trauma, that piece. So we can just dive right into that. As far as the diagram that you provide, again, just delving more into that, why was it important to explain that portion as well in order to understand how that ACEs study applies to us?
Absolutely. So the original ACE pyramid has 5 areas, and I and a colleague of mine, Sam Simmons, we've added additional 2, because when it comes to Black life and Black existence, we can't just start with adverse child experiences. There's a lineage, there's a legacy of trauma that's.
Looks like we're frozen there. Okay, hopefully we come back.
I just let that go.
There we go. Okay, you're frozen. All right, am I back? For a minute. You're back now.
All right. So at the base of that is historical and intergenerational trauma, and that's very important to make sure we have that piece in there. Then right above that is what we call the social context or the environments that people live in. When you are urbanized, when you live in these tight quarters, or you grew up in the projects, or now the new projects are these apartment buildings and these
Mhm.
townhomes that are all across the United States, that has a huge impact on how you develop. When your mother was pregnant with you, if she grew up in poverty, if she grew up with a lot of noise around her, if she grew up struggling, working two jobs with you in her belly, that causes stress. Her cortisol levels are high. That goes to you, and you're born with a high stress tolerance as a child.
Mhm.
All that impacts you, and then the adversity, if you experience it, takes place. So if you get bullied, if you get neglected, if your parent goes to jail, if you see domestic violence, all these things that take place, they end up having an impact. So it's important for us to never lose sight of that social context that we experience before we get to the adversity. And some Black people never have adverse childhood experiences, right? They don't grow up in poverty, etc. But that trauma is still there because our foundation starts from a traumatic place, unfortunately.
Right. And one thing that I really like that you did, again, going back to the course, because that's something that I really
Mm-hmm.
think that everyone should listen to really gain an understanding of what is historical trauma and what that can mean for our families. And so when you talk about not only what we experienced in this country as African Americans, but the journey here, like all of
Mm-hmm.
being captured, being sold, placed at the bottom of boats, shipped, all
Mm-hmm.
of that is trauma that we never really talk about. And I always kind of bring up the Jewish community, even though our experiences are different, but for the
Mm-hmm.
most part, they share their stories. They talk about
Right.
their stories with the next generation, and we want to make sure this never happens again. But we don't really talk about the trauma that we endured. You want to talk about Jim Crow South and just our
Mm-hmm.
experience to this day of continuous to see how Black bodies are treated. So
Right.
all of that also fits into that historical piece and also inherited trauma as well, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And other cultural groups, they will share their response to the pain. They will share what the pain was. They will create holidays or celebrations or rituals to move beyond it. But as Black folks, we haven't done that. We try to avoid it because it makes us feel embarrassed or shamed, etc., to talk about it. Even we don't even have to get into our collective history. We can just talk about our family histories. Think
Right.
about how much family history we don't share. You know, I live in Minnesota. I know over the years I've learned why my family got here.
Mm-hmm.
Some of it was escaping racial terrorism from the South. Some of it was looking for economic opportunity. But ultimately, it was just trying to live and trying to build a family and move forward. That's a lot of our stories. Isabel Wilkerson is a woman who wrote the book Warmth of Other Suns, and she talks about how Black people got to all these places around the United States
Mm-hmm.
from those southern states. It's because we were escaping something. We were looking for opportunity and prosperity when there wasn't a lot of that in the South. And that's real, but we don't talk about it. We don't talk about what happened. We don't share those stories. We will share things like, oh, remember that fight that we got into at so and so's birthday? Like, remember
Right.
that holiday?
Right.
Like, we share the things that are intense, the things that we actually utilize in our own entertainment. But when it comes down to our families, we don't share that. And this is one of the things that I get into a lot of trouble when I talk to my community. And we talk about they don't teach our history in schools. We don't teach our histories at home either. And
Right.
at the end of the day, it ain't up to the schools to teach our history, whether that's our personal history or it's our actual history. It's up to us. And we don't have any excuses anymore because we got Netflix, we got
Mm-hmm.
YouTube, we
Mm-hmm.
got Google, we got all these tools that share our history. It's up to us to push it forward because if we're letting other people tell our narrative, they're going to tell it how they want to and not how it should be told.
Exactly. And I think that's so powerful when you control the narrative of a story. Then you can really inspire your people and say, okay, even though this is a very traumatic past, or even what we go through right now, it's um, is also traumatizing, right? But we can turn that to
Absolutely.
say, okay, even though we've gone through this, look what we're still able to accomplish. Right. This
Absolutely.
hasn't, in some ways, hasn't made life more challenging. Yes, but somehow we were still out of all of that hurt and pain to still build communities, have some type of semblance of family. And so when you can start to have those conversations, you can also open up, okay, let's start talking a little bit about healing because you're being honest about where you came from, so you can have an honest
Mm-hmm.
conversation about where you currently are. But when you try to just sweep everything under the rug and everyone's trying to hide everything, you can't have those conversations at all.
Not at all. Absolutely. Yeah, and it is a miracle that we're still here. And we have to be mindful of that. And we have to own that.
Mm-hmm.
Black folk, there are people around this world that haven't gone through a quarter of what Black people, African American, American descendant slaves, however you want to determine us, have gone through. And we're still here. There are ethnic groups that don't even exist anymore that haven't gone through half or even 30% of what we've gone through. And that there's something to that. Our ability to be resilient and to still have joy, to still love each other, to still care about other people. Like, it amazes me that we go through so much year after year that we still care for other people. That just says something about us and our humanity as melanated people for
Mm-hmm.
others. We shouldn't care about nobody. We should be some of the most self-centered, savage individuals on this planet, but we're not. That says something about us. And we have to make sure that we keep that and we keep moving forward, and we have to thrive, moving and build upon who we are as people. You know, we've learned to kind of exist in this state of struggle. We haven't learned how to evolve, and that's why I do the work that I do, and I
Mm-hmm.
try to help other people evolve. Because guess what? We got a lot of skills, we got a lot of talents. When Black folks get involved in stuff, we always make it better. Anything you think about, we always make something better.
Uh-huh.
We need to make our lives better for not just ourselves as individuals, but also the generations behind us at the end of the day. Because when we put our flavor on it, it always gets better. We think about the happy birthday song.
Uh-huh.
Without Stevie Wonder, man, you start saying happy birthday to, we flip the happy birthday song. We
Yeah,
can flip anything, right? We
it's
can do
true.
this. And that's it.
No, I think that's so true. And it's so funny because so many other people can see our value and what we bring to the table, but unfortunately, we have trouble seeing it for ourselves. And so
Right.
hopefully with the work that you're doing and now with me starting this podcast, that we can begin to really open the eyes of our community and say, listen, you have value, you have worth, you have something to offer to this world. But again, before you can do any of that, as you shared in your story, you have to begin that healing process yourself.
Right.
So if someone's listening today, Brandon, they're like, okay, so like, where do I even start? Yes,
Yeah.
like you said, like maybe I grew up in, maybe I was sexually abused, or maybe a
Mhm.
domestic violence, grew up in a domestic violence household. Where do I even start? I don't even know. I just feel like I'm drowning, and I don't even know where to begin.
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on the situation. If you use a sexual abuse as example, I would say you need to start with counseling.
Mm-hmm.
You need to go to someone out, and for especially for an issue like sexual abuse, I would highly recommend going to someone local. And if you feel more comfortable being around a Black therapist or a Black counselor or even a Black clergy person, that's fine. But make sure it's someone where you feel comfortable enough to actually share with. And it might not be a Black person, it might be someone else, but the thing is, you want to get help for that particular issue. So I would recommend going to someone local. If you're trying to figure out where to just get started with this understanding of trauma as it
Mm-hmm.
pertains to Black folks, I would definitely recommend that you go ahead and just sign up for my 5-day course. It's
Mm-hmm.
absolutely free.
Mm-hmm.
All you got to do is put your email in it, and my course every day you'll get a video that comes straight to you. So I highly recommend that. I don't know if you're going to put that in the description or anything,
Yes,
but we
for
definitely can put a
sure.
link there
Mm-hmm.
for folks. I would definitely recommend that. If not, you can just Google historical trauma on YouTube. If you're like, I'm not too sure about this Brandon guy, but I still want the information, definitely go to YouTube, type in historical trauma, tons of information for you. Or if you're a reader, I would highly recommend Dr. Joy DeGruy Leary and some of her work, because that will give you a great introduction to this whole thing of historical trauma and how we've gotten to where we are today.
Yeah, I think that's excellent. I think, and I read Dr. DeGrew's book, so I think if watch your videos, read her book, I think that really does a great job of laying the foundation to understand.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll say, on a personal note, when I started to kind of deal with my trauma, it really started through historical trauma. Like I started
Yep,
researching and reading about that, and that kind of led me to like begin to deal with my own issues. So
absolutely.
healing, everyone's journey to healing is different.
Yep.
But I do recommend for you to check out, and I will put a link um, to your course in the description box so people can definitely take a look at that.
Absolutely. Can I say one more thing before
Of
we end?
course.
One thing that I want to drive home to folks is that healing is a journey.
Hmm.
And if you expect to be quote unquote healed by the trauma or the adversity that you've experienced, don't set yourself up, because you're gonna deal with things. You're gonna feel better about them. You're gonna be more comfortable with them. But you still have to keep moving forward with life. And depending on how severe the trauma that you experienced is, it may come back up. Even for myself, I've seen some crazy things. I've seen my mom in some very difficult situations. I've done a lot of therapy where I can talk about it without breaking down or getting frustrated. But then when I became a father, it hit me all over again, because it was like, now I'm the parent and I have to make sure my children don't experience the same thing that I experienced. And even now that my children are older and they can ask me questions like, Dad, where's your dad at? Things like that. Like, it hits me again. It's like, oh my God, now I have to explain why I didn't grow up with my father. And I grew up with a stepfather who I don't talk to. They don't even know him. They don't have a clue who he is. Right. And I have to answer questions now. And I know it's going to hit me again once they start having kids and I become a grandparent and whatever else comes up next. So the journey continues for me, and I have to make sure I'm taking care of myself along the way so that I don't get stunted by the emotional pain that I've experienced. So healing is a journey.
I'm glad you said that, for sure. It's ongoing, and you never know what can trigger you.
You never know.
Yeah. So, Brandon, thank you so much for joining us today for this conversation. Is there anything else that you would want to leave folks with, how they can get in contact with you, learn more about you?
Yeah, sure. The best place to get in contact with me is my website. It's www.jegna.org, and Jegna is spelled JEGNA.org. So JEGNA.org. You can email me there and ask me questions. If you struggle to find a 5-day course for whatever reason, I can get you access through that website as well. I do have some products and things like that too. So if you're ready to like move forward with something that we call post-traumatic growth, you definitely can do that. I have a course for that. If you're interested in an audiobook, I have a personal development audiobook as well. So all that stuff's on the website. Feel free to go there. If you have any questions, just reach out to me on the website.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us. That concludes our session for today. Again, Kai Marie here. If you would like to know more information about the healing element, please go to my website, kaimarie.com. And also make sure you sign up for the Journey to Healing newsletter. I will post this interview in the newsletter, so that way people can also have access to it, go back to it, and really take the information and begin to put it into play at home. And that concludes us for today. And remember, healing is a journey. Thanks so much, Brandon, for your time.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
How was that?